She started out in Europe. She was born in Lithuania in 1869. Her family was Jewish, and Russia at the time was very anti-Semitic. They moved to St. Petersburg in 1881 and was there when the Tsar was overthrown, which was Emma Goldman's kind of political awakening. She was educated at home mostly in Russia, and then she moved to Germany to pursue an education in the gymnasiums there. She didn't like the way that they taught, so she decided to teach herself instead, and she moved back to Russia. Around this time, she started thinking about moving to the U.S., and in 1885, she and her older sister Helen moved.
Next page.
Yes.
Conflict.
The first conflicts that she encountered were the Haymarket strikes after she settled. She first moved in with her sister Helen, and then she married a man, Jacob Kirshner, in 1887, and a year later she divorced him, and then around that time became an anarchist. She was in a cafe when she met Alexander Berkman, and he taught her about anarchism, and she became very intrigued by the subject and went to work with Helen, who was a newspaper editor at the time. The Haymarket Affair was around this time, a couple years earlier. The McCormick Reapers in Chicago picketed for better wages, better working conditions, better hours, the kinds of things that were popular at the time. The police there were violent towards the picketers, and they killed 2 of them. And the next day, a rally formed in the same square, the Haymarket Square, and police opened fire, and a bomb was thrown by no one knows who still. 8 activists there were convicted, and 7 were sentenced to death, and the 8th to imprisonment. And they became martyrs for the anarchist cause. And later, Goldman and Berkman decided to try and assassinate Henry Clay Frick, who was kind of a boss man of the time. And they were unsuccessful, and Alexander Berkman was sentenced to 21 years in prison.
Next.
Yes. There are a few consistent themes in all of her activism. The first being anarchism. She was an anarchist first and foremost, and believed that the government was not a good thing to have in people's lives. It was just an oppressor. Another of her main themes was feminism. She believed that women were equal to men. Her activism from 1901 to 1916 centered a lot around free speech, which is what she was ultimately imprisoned for. Due to the Comstock laws, which are at the bottom of the page, I'll talk about them later, suppressed free speech by allowing people to be in prison for talking about so-called nasty subjects like birth control and things like that. Ben Reitman was one of her colleagues, I suppose. He was also an anarchist. He allowed Emma Goldman to speak at one of his venues once, and then they struck up a relationship. Mother Earth magazine was Emma Goldman's periodical that she published from 1906 to 1917. It was popular. The Comstock laws were laws that suppressed obscene literature and articles of immoral use. And they tried to stop the use of birth control because it was seen as immoral. But it didn't really work particularly well. So, and and she was arrested for that twice. There was a lot of birth control at the time, just like there is today. The Comstock laws didn't stop distribution of it, it just changed the way it was marketed. They were marketed as hygiene products instead of birth control, and there were a lot of deaths and injuries due to improper usage because people didn't know how to use it due to the Comstock laws. Margaret Singer was a birth control activist. She worked as a nurse at Planned Parenthood, which she set up, and tried to get the right for women to use birth control. Her activism in 1917 to 1919 was mainly centered around the World War I and anti-militarism. And because she was an anarchist, she didn't believe that the government had the right to force people with the draft to fight in a war that it decided to have. So she founded the No Conscription League, and that was illegal due to various laws of the time. They vocally opposed the draft. They spoke a lot about it. It was very popular. She was arrested for that as well. She and Berkman were arrested for conspiring against the draft in 1917 and were sentenced to 2 years in prison. They served the full 2 years there in Missouri State. And she was arrested by J. Edgar Hoover, and he persecuted her himself. And she was released in November of 1919 and arrested 1 month later. She didn't stop her activism after the U.S. She also wrote an autobiography called Living My Life. That's a quote from it. My life I had lived in its heights and its depths, in bitter sorrow and ecstatic joy, in black despair and fervent hope. I had drunk the cup to the last drop. I had lived my life. Would I had the gift to paint the life I had lived. Those were the last lines of her book. She fought for free speech in the Soviet Union, the same way, well, not the same way, but in a similar way as she fought for it in the U.S. She spoke with Lenin and Berkman. They talked about the suppression of non-Bolshevism in Russia, and the government was not responsive towards their pleas.
Of course they weren't.
And she moved after that to London to gain support for the cause. She returned to the U.S. provided that she limit her speaking topics to literature and drama, and she decided to talk about the drama of world events and new regimes. She was also involved in the Spanish Civil War. She was the head of the anarchist propaganda movement during that. And I also have my bibliography and my process paper.
Show it to them.
Thank you.
I just have one question. You said that J. Edgar Hoover, did he persecute or prosecute her? You said persecute. Okay.
Sorry.
Well, they're entirely different.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So how many times total did she get arrested, and how much time did she actually spend in jail?
Twice. She was arrested twice. The first time for a couple months, I think 2, and then the second time for 2 years.
Well, I'm pretty sure she was a very popular girl at that time, right?
She was, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So who do you think she really influenced to change? I mean, what impact did she have? Summarize it first.
She had a lot of influence over anarchists of the time. Her feminism was very popular, sort of, among some women. teachers and immigrant women mainly. So, and there were some suffragettes that she knew and trained, and that was part of her legacy. You had a question?
Did she?
There's that, in Iowa, we have, do we still have the Emma Goldman Clinic in Iowa
Yes, we
City?
do. That was on one of my pages that I actually had to get rid of.
Okay.
Yeah, it's inspired by her.
Do you know, are there other clinics like that around the United States, or is that just something
I
that's?
don't
I
know.
don't know either.
Yeah, I wonder why Iowa City picked, you know,
Yeah,
she's not from, she never was in Iowa, was she?
no,
She was in Chicago.
in Illinois.
Closest
a
she
lot.
was Missouri. You said she was, didn't
Missouri and Illinois.
Yeah, yeah. And was she a US citizen
No,
ever? No.
no.
How did she travel back and forth between the United States and Russia and every place else she went?
By sea.
But I mean, what kind of a passport would she have? And
Uh,
if she was causing all this trouble, I would think they'd be on the lookout for her.
she married someone in London. It was a green card marriage,
Mm.
basically. They both knew, so
Yeah, how many times was she actually married? Just
Twice.
Twice, yeah. That's what I was saying.
So you said she wasn't a U.S. citizen? I thought on the one page it said Hoover was
she had
allowed to
like
strip her citizenship.
temporary citizenship,
Okay.
but
It's basically like a permit.
yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so our National History project for our exhibit is the telegraph. Our title is an exploration using the key vocab of a new information exchange. That's our project thesis. So on exhibit, we don't really have a lot of words. We have 500 word limit. So a lot of our words are used for picture captions and all sorts of stuff, timelines. But the main thing we get is we get this thesis where we have to explain our whole project in one little thing. And so this is what we have. We're instead of focusing on one, we try and throw in as many like other key theme as we can because that's really important to National History Day. So in 1832, when sailing home from Europe, Samuel Morse learned of a newly discovered electromagnet. The encounter would spark the idea of creating an electric telegraph. Would eventually, through his exploration of new means of communication, Morse would send the first telegraph message from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore in 1843. The telegraph allowed Americans to quickly exchange messages through an electrical current. Not only did the telegraph revolutionize how newspapers and journalists conducted business, this efficient exchange of information would allow the North to effectively share battle plans and pave the way for a Northern victory in the Civil War. Okay, so we kind of have, this is our thesis, we're going to go into a little bit of what the telegraph is. Specifically, we decided to focus on the Morse telegraph because it had such a huge impact, especially here in the US. So since we're not as familiar with telegraphs today, you have the little key right here that you're going to press, and you have your Morse code that you send. And what happens is you have the electrical line and current, which connected to another station. You get those, when it's turned on, we'll get that signal passing through. So you get that messages. So you tap out your code, they get your message, they interpret your message, and eventually it became, instead of people having to figure out what they're trying to say from the other station, they actually got machines to do it, which became even more efficient for the telegraph. So.
And with this, when the people started out, they would have to write down the message, but it became that they would be able to hear it and figure it out without having to write it down, and that's when the tapping turned into beeping.
So we have early versions of what kind of inspired Morse's telegraph, and actually when he worked on his telegraph, there's actually many people around the world working on this similar idea, and he was just kind of the first one to get his idea out there and get that in the patent office, which actually was a long battle for him. We have a lot of early like smoke signals and a lot of different stuff that people communicate. One of the more popular ones was the semaphore, and that was mostly used in Europe. And it's like a little station you see here, and you have like this big arm on it, and the arm moves in special ways, and you have a telescope, and usually it's going to be on a hill. So you have your telescope in this station. You're going to look on the other hill. So you're like, I think that's a G, and then write down that message. And then I also wondered, I'm like, so they have to be on hills, and you're using a telescope. Like, how far away is this that you can't go run over there? And just, it's really that important. We also have the electric telegraph, which is pretty similar to Morse's idea. It also is really inefficient, and he was what they described as bubbles and corresponding letters, but it can only go 1 kilometer. Like it can only go so far, the line of electrical current. But it was a good start to Morse's idea, I guess you could say. But they just didn't quite figure out how to use the electric magnet in it, in which they could get long distances. So.
We have a longer timeline for our actual board, but this is just a short kind of timeline of Samuel Morse and some exchanges with the telegraph. It's not on here, but he was born in 1791, and in 1811 he left for England to study art, and on one of his voyages back, he overheard someone talking about the electromagnet, and his idea of the electromagnet telegraph came about. In 1835, on another voyage back from Europe, he draws up the recording telegraph, and finally in 1840, he is granted the patent in the United States for the telegraph. But there are a lot of problems that go with this. For example, in 1854, there's the O'Reilly versus Morse, and a lot of people, including his partner, who was Charles, was claiming that he was the one that invented it because he was with him when he was drawing up the plans in 1835. But the court case actually said that he was the first one to invent the telegraph. And in 1842, he started to experiment with underwater transmitting, which would eventually lead to 1852, which was a really big deal for European countries. They installed a submarine telegraph through the English Channel, and it began direct communications between France and England. And then in 1858, in the I guess that's not that part, but in 1844, the first message from Baltimore to DC was transmitted, and it is "What hath God wrought." That was the first message. And then in 1858, the first message sent from Queen Victoria to President Buchanan was sent, and that started a huge exchange between European countries and the United States. And finally in 1872, he dies of pneumonia. More on him. His parents, Elizabeth and Jediah, were huge advocates for education, and he was sent to Yale, where here he found interest in not only electricity but art, and this was the path that he would take first, which would be the reasons why he traveled to Europe so often. But his parents didn't like that, so he worked in a bookstore for quite a while until he finally pushed so hard that his father said he could leave to England, where he would study with a lot of huge artists at the time. Some of his well-known paintings are Dying Hercules, the House of Representatives, the Gallery of the Louvre. And while he was over there, his wife died, and by the time he got back, she was already buried. And then a year later or so, his father died. 3 years later, his mother died, and he was very depressed. And to solve his grief, he would go over to England, which that year, I believe 1832, was when he would meet Charles, and his idea of the telegraph would come into play. Those are some of his paintings. The top one is House of Representatives, the bottom is the Louvre, The one on the left is Diamond Hercules, and the one on the right is General Lafayette.
I remember when we first started researching it, we got really confused if his painting was in the Louvre or if it was of the Louvre, so that was a huge thing. We were like, because we kept seeing things pop up, oh, his painting was in the Louvre, that's cool. Oh wait, no, it's of the Louvre, which we're like, that's pretty impressive. He took a painting of multiple paintings, so, and his artwork's really good. Going on why he decided to go into the Telegraph, so his wife dies, and a huge thing that a lot of people like to cite as the reason why he got into the Telegraph was because he felt he no longer could do art, and why the Telegraph became such prominent in his life. When his wife died, he gets a letter from his father saying that his wife is gravely ill, and so he immediately takes the train because he was in Connecticut, and he's in DC and his wife's in Connecticut, so he immediately takes it and he tries to get to her as fast as she can. By the time he gets there, she's already buried. Like, not only is she dead, but she's buried and gone, and so that was just a huge crushing blow for him because he was really in love with his wife, so that was really sad for him. So I think that's probably why he, after that, quit painting, and because he kind of didn't really have that joy in his life. We talked about a little bit about it took a while for him to get the patent. So they actually took a long U.S. Senate lobbying, and his one of his good friends went out there and spent a whole night just lobbying for him to get this patent, and his name is Ellsworth, and that's the reason why the message is what hath God wrought, is because his Ellsworth's daughter, who was 17 at the time, picked out the message, and that was his way of showing his things for him for lobbying to get his message out. So,
I don't know, before the Telegraph was actually put out, he had a lot of struggle finding investors, and finally in 1838, Alfred Vail was partnered with him, and it's kind of interesting to think how all these people missed out on such a great opportunity to invest with him, because it led to the wars, and it was used in wars, and it eventually led to the telephone and radios and other communications.
And I mean, also in timeline, I kind of just one of those that we kind of just said, oh, he died of pneumonia. He actually, a lot of other inventors like him, like Thomas Edison, got like notified by the president. When Graham Bell died, they did a moment of silence on the telephone lines. When he died, he got a parade, and like the entire like New York City, they got like the music academy, like all these different events going on. He didn't really get to go to the events. He actually ended up just staying for the finale. Like, it was this huge deal, and he just underneath the stage there you had like the whole telegraph thing going, and his last couple words got put over the telegraph, and it was actually a pretty big deal. When he ended up dying, he got to go out with a little bang, so that was just kind of interesting. I mean, it kind of puts forth how prominent the telegraph was and how important it was. I mean, even Graham Bell, who invented the telephone, didn't quite get the parade that Morse did.
Run forward here.
Oh.
I can. So we have our Morse code. I think one of the biggest questions I had going into is like, this doesn't make sense. I don't know, like my thing would be like, oh, like the numbers like dot, like it makes sense somehow. The numbers make a little bit more sense. What I came to realize, he actually did it based on how common the letters are, is how easy the dot or the dot dashes are. And so it's used in the Civil War, World War I, World War II. Germany used it, and I think one of the biggest questions we immediately were like, wait, how did Germany use it? Don't they have like a different language, And then so immediately I'm like, all right, how many letters does the German alphabet have? And they have 26, so it works. So that's how they did it. I don't know how other countries, I guess, they use similar codes, but they didn't quite use Morse's code, which is based on the 26 letters.
I always remember as a little kid asking my parents what SOS stood for, as I never really knew. I knew it stood for a distress signal, but it doesn't actually stand for anything. It was because of the convenience of the dots and dashes.
So just overall impact of the telegraph, it's just huge impact of, we're talking about inspiring so many inventions afterwards, even though it honestly didn't have that long a time period. I mean, they built the Continental Railroad, but eventually, kind of a little bit after it, its lifespan kind of ended and eventually completely disappeared with the invention of the telephone, internet, fax machine, but it was the beginning. It was the turning point. We also see battle plans. It was huge war impact. We're talking about horseback riding all the way from this descent to another descent to an instant. Here's what we were planning, here's what we're doing. Completely changed how the North fought compared to the South. They had all these lines. Abraham Lincoln they had a room where they're constantly typing messages. He's immediately there and able to talk to his generals, and that's why Lincoln was able to get a prominent role in his own war and his own battles. Because of the telegraph, and the newspapers and journalists. Before, news was kind of like, all right, I heard from this person this, so it usually got changed a lot. Eventually, through newspaper to newspaper across the country, this was just straight. Here's the facts. Here's what happened. Here's the event, and we're talking all across the country. You hear this. Also, money, quick exchange of money, wiring across the country, and just overall faster, bigger, better, which was like what America is. So, faster information. So.
Do you need to redo that last word up there?
Oops.
Instantaneously?
Yeah. We so our thing is exhibit. So we had to put this together last
No,
night.
that's
So
fine.
we had
No,
something to
I'm
present.
just saying,
Yeah.
I don't recognize that word. I was just
Yeah.
wanted to be sure.
Is there any more?
So these are just we want to make sure that we had our sources that we just used for the presentation. So we pulled these from our bibliography.
Sure.
So yeah, that's a
Thank you.
see that for us.
Question. So, do you guys know what his last words were?
Yeah, I have them written down too. Let's see. I have a couple notes. Okay. Greeting and thanks to the telegraph fraternity throughout the world. Glory to God and in the highest, on earth peace, goodwill to men. And he signed it S.F.B. Morris. So that was his final words. He even died 10 months later, only 10 months later, so really was his last message, so.
So, when the telegraph was invented, I'm just trying to think about North versus South in Civil War. The South didn't have access to that technology, or?
The huge thing in the Civil War is you have the North, you had the industrial, they had the money, they had the power to build the railroad, and so they got more railroads, which equals more telegraph lines across the railroads, and so it's just kind of, the South wasn't quite up to that. They were more at the agriculture, so they didn't have that
They didn't have that
technology,
infrastructure.
yeah.
Okay.
So.
They could have, but they didn't.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it was they didn't realize how important the telegraph would be and how important that, and from until later in the war it became more common. It was still kind of gaining ground as popularity towards the war. So.
Well, plus the fact that they were not thinking it was going to last very long either.
Oh yeah.
No
So-
big deal. We don't have to worry about this. It'll be over in 6 months. No.
True, yeah.
Well, that didn't work, did it?